He was given away by his own parents. He dropped out of college after 6 months. He got fired from the very company he built with his own hands. And yet, this same man walked back into that company years later and changed the way the entire world lives, works, listens to music, and talks to each other. This is not just a biography. This is the story of Steve Jobs, a man who turned rejection into rocket fuel, and turned a garage into the beginning of a trillion-dollar empire. Let's go back to February 24, 1955, San Francisco. A baby boy is born to two unmarried graduate students, Joanne Schiebel and Abdul Fattah Jandali. Joanne's family did not approve of the relationship, and she made the painful decision to put the baby up for adoption. The baby was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple from Mountain View, California. They named him Stephen Paul Jobs. Paul Jobs was a mechanic, and from a very young age, he taught little Steve how to take things apart and put them back together in the family garage. That garage, that simple wooden garage, would later become one of the most famous places in the history of technology. Steve was a curious child, but not exactly a disciplined student. He was bored in school, he questioned authority, and teachers often struggled to control him. But there was one thing that fascinated him endlessly: electronics. In the late 1960s, the area around Mountain View and Palo Alto was slowly becoming what we now call Silicon Valley, filled with engineers, inventors, and hobbyists. Steve grew up surrounded by this energy. At just 12 years old, he once called Bill Hewlett, the co-founder of Hewlett-Packard, straight from a phone book, asking for spare parts for a school project. Hewlett was so impressed by the boy's confidence that he not only gave him the parts but also offered him a summer internship. This tells you everything about young Steve Jobs: fearless, direct, and completely unwilling to accept no as an answer. It was during his high school years that Steve met a young man named Steve Wozniak, an engineering genius who was building electronic gadgets just for fun. The two Steves bonded instantly over their shared love for technology and their rebellious streak. Wozniak had the technical brilliance, and Jobs had something else: vision, salesmanship, and an obsessive eye for how things should look and feel. Together, they would later build one of the greatest partnerships in business history, but that story comes a little later. In 1972, Steve Jobs enrolled at Reed College in Oregon, a small, expensive liberal arts school. But within just 6 months, he dropped out. Why? Because he felt his parents' hard-earned savings were being spent on classes that meant nothing to him. Instead of leaving campus completely, he did something unusual: he stayed and audited classes he actually found interesting, sleeping on friends' floors, returning Coke bottles for food money, and walking miles across town for a free meal at the local Hare Krishna temple every Sunday. One of the classes he audited was a calligraphy course, where he learned about typefaces, spacing, and the beauty of well-designed lettering. At the time, it seemed like a completely useless skill with no career value. But years later, when Steve Jobs designed the first Macintosh computer, this same calligraphy knowledge became the reason the Mac had multiple beautiful fonts and proportionally spaced text, something no other computer had at the time. This single decision changed how every computer in the world would display text forever. Jobs later said that if he had never dropped in on that calligraphy class, personal computers might never have had beautiful typography at all. After leaving Reed, Steve Jobs traveled to India in 1974, searching for spiritual enlightenment. He shaved his head, wore simple Indian clothing, and wandered through ashrams trying to find deeper meaning in life. He came back not with religious answers, but with a mindset, a Zen-like simplicity, an obsession with minimalism, and a belief that intuition mattered more than complex analysis. This philosophy would later define every single Apple product design: clean, simple, uncluttered, almost meditative in its appearance. By 1976, Steve Jobs was 21 years old, and Steve Wozniak had built something extraordinary in his spare time: a fully functional personal computer circuit board, something that hobbyists were amazed by. Jobs immediately saw something Wozniak didn't: this wasn't just a hobby project, this was a product that could be sold. Jobs convinced Wozniak to go into business together. They needed money to start, so Jobs sold his Volkswagen van, and Wozniak sold his beloved scientific calculator. With just $1,300, on April 1, 1976, Apple Computer Company was born, right there in the Jobs family garage. The name Apple itself came from Jobs, inspired by his visits to an apple orchard and a desire for a name that sounded fun, simple, and approachable, nothing like the cold, technical names other computer companies used. Their first product, the Apple I, was sold as a bare circuit board to hobbyists. It gave them just enough traction and credibility to build something bigger. In 1977, they launched the Apple II, and this is where everything changed. The Apple II was not just a machine for engineers anymore. It had a sleek plastic case, color graphics, and was designed to sit comfortably in a regular family's living room. It became one of the first personal computers to achieve massive commercial success, selling in the hundreds of thousands, turning Apple from a garage experiment into a company worth millions of dollars almost overnight. Investors poured in, and by December 1980, when Apple went public, Steve Jobs, still in his mid-20s, became a multimillionaire almost overnight. But success brought its own storm. In 1979, Jobs visited Xerox PARC, a research lab that had developed something revolutionary but never commercialized it properly, a graphical user interface with windows, icons, and a mouse, instead of the plain black screens with typed commands that everyone was used to. The moment Jobs saw this, he knew this was the future. He raced back to Apple and pushed his engineers to build this into their next big project, the Macintosh. The development of the Macintosh was intense, chaotic, and driven almost entirely by Jobs' relentless perfectionism. He would reject prototypes over the smallest design flaws, the curve of a corner, the sound of a switch, even the internal layout of circuit boards that users would never actually see, because he wanted every single Apple engineer to take pride in their craftsmanship, seen or unseen. In January 1984, Apple launched the Macintosh with one of the most legendary television commercials in advertising history, directed by Ridley Scott, aired during the Super Bowl, showing a dystopian world being shattered by a symbol of freedom and individuality. The Macintosh introduced the world to the mouse, the graphical desktop, and icons, the very foundation of how we still use computers, smartphones, and tablets today. But behind the scenes, something darker was brewing. Jobs' management style was intense, sometimes brutal. He could be publicly harsh, dismissive, and demanding. He clashed constantly with Apple's CEO, John Sculley, a man Jobs himself had personally recruited from Pepsi with the now famous question, "Do you want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Ironically, it was this very same Sculley who, in 1985, sided with the Apple board of directors and stripped Steve Jobs of any real power within the company he had founded. At just 30 years old, Steve Jobs was pushed out of Apple. This was, by his own later admission, one of the most painful periods of his life. He described it as a very public failure, feeling like he had let down an entire generation of entrepreneurs. But instead of disappearing, Jobs did what he always did best, he started again. He founded a new computer company called Next, focused on high-end computers for education and business, featuring an advanced operating system built with cutting-edge object-oriented technology. Next computers were not huge commercial hits, but the software they built quietly became one of the most technologically important foundations in Apple's future, more on that in a moment. At the same time, in 1986, Jobs made another investment that would define pop culture forever. He purchased a small computer graphics division from filmmaker George Lucas's company, Lucasfilm, for just $10 million. He renamed it Pixar. At the time, Pixar was mostly a hardware company selling expensive graphics computers, and it struggled financially for years, draining millions from Jobs' personal fortune. But Jobs believed in the small animation team inside Pixar, led by a visionary named John Lasseter. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the world's first entirely computer-animated feature film. It was a massive success, both critically and commercially, and it completely transformed the animation industry forever. Pixar would go on to create Finding Nemo, Monsters Inc., The Incredibles, and many more beloved classics. In 2006, Disney bought Pixar for over $7 billion, making Steve Jobs the largest individual shareholder of the Walt Disney Company. Meanwhile, Apple, without Jobs, was struggling badly. Their products were falling behind, their operating system was outdated, and the company was losing billions of dollars, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. In a move that shocked the entire tech world, Apple acquired Next in 1996 for over $400 million, bringing Steve Jobs back into the company as an advisor. The advanced operating system he had built at Next eventually became the foundation of Mac OS X, the operating system that powers Apple computers even today. In 1997, with Apple on the brink of collapse, the board asked Steve Jobs to step in as interim CEO. He returned to a company that was a shadow of what he had built. He immediately slashed Apple's bloated product lineup from dozens of confusing models down to just 4 core products. He negotiated a stunning, controversial deal with Apple's biggest rival, Microsoft, securing a $150 million investment to keep Apple financially alive. Slowly, painfully, he began rebuilding the company from its core. In 1998, Apple launched the iMac, a colorful, translucent, all-in-one computer that looked completely unlike anything else on the market. It was a design triumph and a commercial success, signaling that Apple was back. But this was just the beginning of what would become one of the greatest runs of innovation in business history. In 2001, Apple launched the iPod, a simple, elegant portable music player with the tagline, "1,000 songs in your pocket." At a time when portable music players were bulky, ugly, and complicated, the iPod's simplicity and its accompanying iTunes software completely revolutionized how the entire world listened to music, eventually leading to the digital music revolution and the near-total collapse of the traditional CD industry. Then, in January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced something that would not just change Apple, but would change human civilization itself: the iPhone. He described it as 3 revolutionary products in one: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. There were no physical keyboards, no styluses, just a beautiful glass screen you could control with your fingers. Critics were skeptical at first. But within a few short years, the iPhone didn't just succeed, it redefined an entire industry. It killed physical keyboards on phones. It gave birth to the App Store, an entirely new global economy of mobile applications worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It changed how people take photos, how they navigate cities, how they communicate, how businesses operate, and how information spreads across the planet. Today, more than a decade later, nearly every smartphone in the world, regardless of brand, borrows fundamentally from the design language Steve Jobs introduced that day. In 2010, Apple launched the iPad, creating and defining an entirely new product category, the tablet computer, bridging the gap between smartphones and laptops, and transforming industries from education to healthcare to creative design. But even as Apple was reaching unimaginable heights, Steve Jobs was fighting a private battle. In 2003, he was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. Initially, he tried alternative treatments, delaying conventional surgery, a decision he would later regret. Eventually, he underwent surgery and later a liver transplant, but the cancer persisted. Despite his declining health, Jobs continued leading Apple, delivering iconic product launches, often looking visibly thinner and weaker each year, yet refusing to stop pushing forward. In August 2011, Steve Jobs resigned as CEO of Apple, handing over leadership to Tim Cook, a trusted executive who had worked alongside him for years. Just 6 weeks later, on October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56, surrounded by his family. The news spread across the globe within minutes. People gathered outside Apple stores worldwide, lighting candles, laying flowers, and leaving handwritten notes on the very devices he had created. World leaders, competitors, and ordinary people alike paused to acknowledge that a truly singular force in human innovation had been lost. So why does Steve Jobs matter so much, even today? Because he was never just a businessman chasing profit. He was obsessed with the intersection of technology and art, believing that the best products should not only function brilliantly but should feel emotionally beautiful to use. He didn't invent the computer, the MP3 player, the smartphone, or the tablet, but he perfected them, simplified them, and made them irresistibly desirable to ordinary people, not just engineers. He turned Apple into not just a technology company, but a cultural symbol, an emblem of creativity, simplicity, and rebellion against the ordinary. His famous words still echo across classrooms, boardrooms, and graduation speeches worldwide: "Stay hungry, stay foolish." He believed deeply that you could only connect the dots looking backward, that you had to trust that the seemingly random experiences of your life, even a random calligraphy class, would somehow connect into something meaningful in your future. He believed failure was not the opposite of success, but a necessary and often painful stepping stone toward it. From a boy given up for adoption, to a college dropout sleeping on floors, to the founder of a garage startup, to being publicly humiliated and thrown out of his own company, to rebuilding not one but two revolutionary companies, to ultimately becoming the man who placed a supercomputer in the pocket of billions of people worldwide, Steve Jobs' life was not a straight line to success. It was full of failure, heartbreak, obsession, and relentless reinvention. He didn't just build products. He built the modern digital world we live in today, the phone in your hand, the way you scroll, tap, swipe, and connect with people across the planet in an instant. Every single time you unlock your smartphone, you are witnessing a small piece of Steve Jobs' vision, still alive, still shaping the world, even years after he's gone. And that is exactly why, decades from now, when people study the history of human innovation, one single name will always stand right at the very top: Steve Jobs, the man who didn't just predict the future, but built it with his own hands.